The thought that my mother-in-law won't be around for much longer is a comfort. I took some paid time off to spend a night away from the house where I live with my in-laws to attend my youngest brother's wedding. As I packed my overnight bag, my mother-in-law's voice called out after me, "Why don't you just never come back? And while you're at it, why don't you get a divorce and leave?" I smiled subtly, accepting her malice, and left the house without looking back. I paused to say goodbye to our house before going too far. I appreciated everything it had done for me despite my mother-in-law's lack of attention. Carrying a somewhat large bag, I hurried to the location where my dear family awaited. The hotel would be my home for 3 days and 2 nights, and my mother-in-law had no idea I wouldn't be returning. What happens next is still a secret. I'm Selena Jason, a 48-year-old part-time employee, balancing the management of our hectic home with my office work. Dean and I have been married for over 30 years. Despite our arranged marriage, we get along well and share similar values. The only challenge in our relationship is Dean's career as a sailor, which often keeps him away for over a year at a time. We are blessed with a son, and our connection remains strong. Until recently, we lived with my in-laws, primarily caring for Dean's grandmother. I managed her care almost entirely on my own, paying a caretaker during the day. This arrangement continued until her passing. Tears filled my eyes as Dean expressed his gratitude for the attention I gave her. She spent her last years surrounded by great-grandchildren and received excellent care. Though Dean's profession keeps him away, I'm proud of his significant contributions to American logistics. After her grandmother's death, my mother-in-law's behavior changed drastically. She once tried to be kind to me while pushing all the caregiving duties onto me, but once I stopped, she began to completely disregard me. She would exclude me from outings and intentionally bump into me within the home. Her blatant hostility was unsettling. During one of Dean's absences, my son Russell mentioned, "Grandma's saying nasty things again." When Russell was only 4 or 5, my mother-in-law made up stories to convince him that my father hated me and that I was cheating on Dean, which she claimed was why Dean didn't come home. Discovering these falsehoods left me astounded. I was diligently doing domestic tasks and working hard every day, not cheating. Dean's absences were due to his job, not my actions. Convincing a child of such lies was absurd. I focused on calming a worried Russell rather than dwelling on her words. I was relieved when Dean returned and reprimanded her for her behavior. Now that Dean is back, my mother-in-law seems to be making the most of his presence by keeping me busy. Despite the caregiving being over, she insists on meticulous cleaning and gives me difficult recipes to follow. Recently, she hosted a drama marathon, inviting local ladies over, leaving a mess of drink spills and food wrappers for me to clean up. It added more work during an already hectic time before dinner. I was sweating from the cleanup, irritated by her constant demands to hurry up and make supper. She claimed to be too full from snacks, but didn't even sit at the table for dinner. Russell's complaint that my mother-in-law said she didn't like me and that I should go away only made me more irate. He suggested it might be best if we lived apart from her. After calming down Russell and preparing him for bed, I knew I needed to have a serious conversation with Dean. One day, after Russell left, I suddenly started to feel sick. I was sweating, my face was hot, and my limbs were freezing. My menopausal symptoms were especially bad on that specific day. Since last year, I've been feeling strange, and the doctors have determined that it's menopause. They were monitoring my condition without prescribing anything, but there were difficult days. I questioned if the stress from my mother-in-law's actions was affecting my health. By nightfall, I felt worse and found myself resting in my room. My mother-in-law was yelling at me to come to supper as I heard her approaching. I was having trouble simply sitting up. I thought about pretending to be asleep, but she pulled the cover off me. She clapped her hands and demanded supper, so I reluctantly sat up. Given that my grandmother-in-law used to manage the kitchen, I reasoned that if my mother-in-law wanted supper, she should prepare it herself. Lately, it had just been me in the kitchen. My mother-in-law hardly ever went in there except to set the dishes while Dean was home. Maybe she wasn't a good chef. I told her I was having trouble with menopause and couldn't do the chores today since I was so tired. Having experienced menopausal symptoms herself, I thought she would understand. Her response, though, was far from empathetic. She snorted, turned a sack over my head, and I screamed a little in the darkened room as things fell down around me. I was nauseous after waking up but wasn't sure why right away. A minute later, I discovered the fragrance surrounding me was that of potatoes. My mother-in-law had thrown snack crumbs all over me, and the bag she'd have flipped upside down was almost empty. It was so unexpected that I was taken aback. With a tongue click, she exited the room. I lay in bed, hurting, reprimanded, and drenched in crumbs. Rather than being angry, I experienced an odd, almost dreamlike feeling, as though I was seeing something peculiar. My patience was beginning to wear thin. I took a paid leave of absence from work about 6 months later to prepare for a trip to my younger brother's wedding. After living together for a few years, he was finally getting married to his girlfriend. Their house is in New York, so I made reservations for a 3-day, 2-night stay at a hotel. Despite my brother's offer to pay, I chose to handle the hotel expenses myself since I wanted to set my own hours. Although it was a modest ceremony with just relatives, I was looking forward to attending because it was a rare opportunity for everyone to be together. I planned a week's worth of meals ahead of time, figuring no one else would be cooking during my vacation. I told my in-laws about the meals I had made and put in the fridge the evening before I left. During supper, my mother-in-law appeared unhappy, but my father-in-law praised me. "What's the deal with all the fuss? It's your brother's wedding. Why even attend? Isn't this simply a remarriage? Probably nothing noteworthy," she scowled, more than just a stare. My father-in-law gave her a look. "Actually, both my brother and his partner are getting married for the first time," I corrected her. My mother-in-law seemed to be misinterpreting the situation as she laughed crudely. "A first marriage at 40 must indicate a personal issue with him. Even though your brother is young, why is he getting married in style?" "Insolent," she said. It seemed she had either forgotten my family structure or was mistaking my brother for someone else. In reality, I have 3 brothers, and my youngest brother is still very young, considering we are separated by 14 years. My youngest brother, who is in his early 30s, is marrying a woman in her 20s. My mother-in-law was insulted by the correction when I told her this. Her next statement was even more snide, comparing the age difference between a parent and child to that of a girlfriend in her 20s. It surprised me that she wouldn't listen. My father-in-law cleared his throat as if he realized what had happened. "She's not just 20, she's in her 20s, I attempted to explain. Their ages barely differ by 4 or 5 years. That seems sensible, doesn't it?" She appeared rather reasonable when we chatted on a video conference. Lately, I wrapped up my conversation with my in-laws and got ready to head out. I made sure I had everything I needed in my bag and prepared a gorgeous attire for the wedding. From the living room, I could hear my mother-in-law speaking loudly and angrily to my father-in-law. Knowing it would be best to avoid any confrontation, I decided to leave the house as quickly as possible. Feeling a surge of anger, I rolled my somewhat overweight bag towards the front entrance. The following morning, I was briefly stopped by my mother-in-law's parting remarks. "Never come back, and why don't you just get a divorce?" "Yes, as you wish," I replied happily, sounding more composed than I had anticipated. I had long since reached my breaking point and felt more relieved than I realized. Dean had helped me prepare for this day. My mother-in-law laughed and munched on some snacks, seemingly oblivious to the circumstances. The amount of food she could consume first thing in the morning surprised me. I chose to walk to the station. As I turned to look back at the house before continuing, I thought I really owed this house a lot, except for my mother-in-law. For a very long time, Dean, Russell, my father-in-law, and my grandmother-in-law had made this house feel like home. I even felt like I owed the walls and roof. But I didn't remember ever needing my mother-in-law's assistance. I felt so silly for some reason. With somewhat excessive luggage, I hastened to meet my dear family. I was about to move into a new apartment and live alone after spending 3 days and 2 nights at a motel. I met Dean at the wedding location. He was the one we had invited, and when he saw me coming, he handed me a pen and an unsigned divorce document. We decided that signing it would be the last thing we did together as a couple. "Many thanks. Together. Let's complete it when we return to the hotel. I hope it's acceptable that I reserved a twin room," I added. "My brother's marriage today is a sad event but also represents a fresh start for us. We'll disclose the divorce later and not in front of everyone today." Dean and I exchanged a warm smile, both of us realizing the momentous step we were about to take. It seemed so weighty to even consider signing that one piece of paper representing the dissolution of our more than 30-year marriage. Dean comforted me, saying that being with him had always made me truly happy, so I apologized. I didn't mind that he was frequently away from home for work because I knew this from the beginning. Well, except for his mother. Apologize not. You've made a fantastic spouse, I added. Let's stay close friends moving forward. With all the affection I could muster, Dean clasped my hand in tears and thanked me once again, bringing tears to my eyes as well. I decided to blame my emotions on joy for my brother's wedding. Dean went back to his parents' house by himself the following day. He gave his in-laws an explanation of the circumstances, and at first, they were taken aback by the abrupt discussion of divorce. When they heard the whole tale, my father-in-law lost his temper. He yelled, frightening my mother-in-law, "How dare you drive out someone who cared for my mother until the end?" My father-in-law had been a great support and caring partner, even though I had been the one doing most of the physical labor and taking care of my grandmother-in-law. It seems that my father-in-law had secretly grumbled about my mother-in-law's lack of contribution. He went up to her and voiced his complaints. "Since entering the family through marriage, you have never been good at cleaning. You gave birth to our baby, so I remained mute. However, you have taken advantage of my mother's indulgence to avoid lending a hand. Selena accomplished everything. You're nothing like her," he said. The comparison to me made him even more enraged. "You ought to have been the one to depart. It is incomprehensible that we lost a devoted daughter-in-law like Selena who gave us so much. You have made no financial contribution at all." My mother-in-law's stance was undermined when money was brought up. Dean's pay covered all family costs, and she had never worked outside the home. Even though our family was wealthy, I continued to work because I enjoyed it. My income supported the family by paying for theater tickets, vacations, and special occasion fine meals. These actions were investments in getting me some alone time. "Dean, it's not too late." Seeing the seriousness of the situation, my father-in-law at last advised, "Go apologize and ask Selena to marry you again." Despite her distress and desperation, my mother-in-law was powerless to avert the fallout from her actions. "This is the home I constructed," my father-in-law furiously said. "You need to leave," and he started to evict her. In a fit of rage, my mother-in-law screamed and scratched at her tangled hair. Observers found her conduct strange and disturbing. "No, I'm not going anywhere. I refuse to be divorced at this age. How am I meant to live alone?" she said. My father-in-law was physically stronger than her, so he ultimately succeeded in dragging her out of the house despite her struggle. He forcefully closed and locked the door, leaving her to sob loudly, clutching it. The neighbors were frightened by the disturbance and phoned the police. When the police came, my father-in-law opened the door, but his rage lingered for several days. The atmosphere in the house was tense. My father-in-law and mother-in-law avoided one another and even ran away when they saw each other in the same room. It was as though they were living apart. My father-in-law called a family gathering after his distant daughter was put in an unsustainable circumstance. He said, "I'm going to divorce her," but his daughter objected, expressing compassion for my mother-in-law, which made things more difficult to talk about. Dean described the abuse I was subjected to, including the way my mother-in-law had deceived our kid to incite him against me. He talked about my menopausal pain and showed emails from our kid as proof. Having seen it all, my father-in-law voiced his dissatisfaction, saying my mother-in-law had disobeyed his advice to halt her actions and apologize. Dean also brought up how I handled home duties and my grandmother-in-law's care, asking his sister what she would think if her own mother-in-law had acted in the same way. She remained mute when asked which side she would support. Enraged, my mother-in-law bemoaned that her daughter had betrayed her and claimed to have betrayed herself. Her sardonic honesty amused me since, as I discovered, our grandmother was the one who raised us most of the time, something I had always worried about in our family. Mom used to spend a lot of time with her neighbors, chatting about her old days. His sister had looked at my mother-in-law with contempt after learning about the bullying. Ultimately, the only housewives who made a significant contribution were myself and my grandmother-in-law, whom I took care of until her death. Despite having 2 kids, my mother-in-law often shied away from cleaning and took pleasure in the advantages with little effort. Her status was undermined when the family ultimately discovered her pattern of carelessness. My mother-in-law halted her tirades, realized her situation, and started crying. Ultimately, compassion prevented a divorce, but my father-in-law is still considering it. I told my father-in-law that I would want to meet with him when I heard this. After I left, Dean told me about these incidents. He said, Dad should have supported Selena from the beginning if he was going to get so upset now. However, I wasn't present, so what could I say? Sipping his steaming coffee, Dean moaned. We were in our beloved cafe, a spot we have loved since we were little. I selected a soft drink, something I hadn't had in a while, whereas Dean got a coffee. I grinned softly as I heard the specifics of my mother-in-law's shameful actions. Be kind to yourself. Your crucial work required you to be gone. You are relied upon by many, I said sincerely. It is wonderful that Dean, while being gone for years at a time, supports people via marine transportation in his capacity as a sailor. I apologize for this inconvenience, but that's why I've been putting up with it. You have my continued admiration and respect, yet I am unable to stay in your parents' household. At last I said what had been on my mind for a very long time. Though he seemed a little dejected, Dean nodded in agreement. I was relieved that he did not blindly support his parents. I couldn't help but grin widely, and Dean gave me an obviously amazed look. Dean later said that he believed my smile was brighter than it had ever been at that very time. Dean also seemed more endearing than ever to me. Dean assisted me in seeing his father the day following our cafe meeting. It was time for my last bit of retaliation. Dean's father was dressed more elegantly than usual when he showed up at the cafe. I briefly discussed the weather before getting right to the point. Dean told me that you're thinking about divorcing your wife. It's doable while you're still well. But after all this chaos, managing it on your own will be difficult. I'm willing to assist with your latter years of care if you do decide to split. This obviously thrilled his father. Dean could spend a lot of time at sea, and his sister resided far away. He had never been one to help out around the house with cooking, cleaning, or washing, so after seeing his mother through to the end, he would definitely be grateful for my assistance. He crossed his arms and scowled, saying, Of course I'll separate from her. No, hold on, perhaps getting a divorce would be better. I hoped my mother-in-law would be fully removed from the matter since she was quite likely to be removed. Her circumstances looked to be getting worse. If I were to suddenly pass away, she'd probably make a huge fuss, he thought. It's better to divorce her properly before that happens. Dean seemed to steel himself as his father talked with increasing determination. Once he makes up his mind, his father usually follows through on it, sometimes going a little too far, but that's just his personality. After years of cohabiting with him, I smiled and nodded in accord, knowing how to handle him. This kind of little prodding would probably get him to follow through. Dean laughed and saw what I was trying to do but didn't step in. He appeared to be much more irritated than I was by my mother-in-law's actions. Suddenly full of energy, his father sprang up to get the divorce papers. I chose to help him out of goodwill by introducing him to the attorney Dean, and I had consulted for our divorce. My mother-in-law was doomed to live a lonely existence after that day since my father-in-law aggressively pursued the divorce. After a week, I went back to my old house, which was now simply my ex-in-law's place. I went to get possessions that I had previously been unable to take. Even though I had removed most of the items, there were still clothing, books, sentimental mementos, drawings from my son's early years, bedding and furniture that I had paid for with my own money. I had gathered a lot of personal belongings in the residence over the years. I ended up seeing my mother-in-law for the last time on this visit. She was clearly in a panic, as her divorce had already been settled by that point. She knelt in front of me as I collected my possessions, her face pale, and she started apologizing. Margaret, I sincerely apologize. I ask you please, it was a joke. Kindly return and convince your spouse, she pleaded. I ignored my mother-in-law's pleadings and kept packing. She got to her feet quickly, insulting me and going back to her old ways, furious at my lack of interest. How can you disregard me when I'm acting so modestly? Since being a member of this family, you have only caused problems. Simply depart and pass away by yourself, she screamed. He barked and spat at me after hurling a string of less complex, unrepeatable slurs. I ignored her again and concentrated on putting my belongings in a cardboard box. She let out a sudden cry and rushed towards the box, turning it over. Startled, I ducked as she had a fit, kicking and stomping the clothing, scattering them across the floor. Enough? Dean scowled at his mother and yelled. His normally submissive nature had grown into a powerful figure, surprising his mother despite his habit of complying. I turned to my mother-in-law and held Dean back with one hand while maintaining a neutral look. I am not your daughter-in-law anymore. You are not my mother-in-law anymore. We are no longer in a relationship. I'm grateful for nothing. It was not you but your father-in-law and grandmother that assisted me. I hurried over the jumbled garments and stuffed them into the box without folding any of them. Strange, don't touch my belongings. Farewell, I said, directing a final remark at my messy mother-in-law. I hurried out of the room, ready to be away from her. I gave Dean a call to take care of the stuff that was left. I waited for my brother to go after getting into his car. My mother-in-law was still screaming inside the home, but I wasn't going to waste time listening. I heard her weep in sorrow and keep beating her own head after we departed. She appeared to regret cutting off her final hope, but there was never going to be a possibility for reconciliation. Sadly, it was too late for her regrets to be significant. My mother-in-law was ultimately forced to move out and started living alone in a small apartment about a month later. Every now and again, Dean and his sister stop over to see how she's doing. I've heard that she resides indoors most of the time, hardly takes a shower, and wears her old clothing as pajamas. She spends her days eating cheap snacks and fast food and complaining about how poor her life is. Even though she and my father-in-law divided some assets during the divorce, it wasn't much, which meant she would be financially unstable as she aged. Personally, I'm not offering any assistance. Is that not evident? Dean's mother was always proud of him because he was a well-paid sailor. It never occurred to her that her own kid might cut her off altogether. Ironically, she is now the one who is unable to return, despite having previously advised me to leave and obtain a divorce. Similar to the proverb, curses return upon those who curse, my mother-in-law ought to have been prepared to deal with her own bad luck if she cast bad luck wishes on other people. I live a quiet life with my cat in an apartment approximately 30 minutes away from my former in-law's house. 5 years after the divorce, I chose this location since it would make my commute to work easier. The rental is a nice property with plenty of sunlight and is pet-friendly. Every week, I still go see my ex-father-in-law and make him different meals. Since the divorce, our relationship seems to have improved. Considering how much I still assist, my distant sister-in-law can scarcely meet my sight. Dean and I communicate frequently. We make it a point to go on dates as soon as he gets back from his lengthy maritime travels. It's like opening a fresh chapter. Though we are relatively new to this, we like going to movies and museums, and our relationship seems new and exciting. We find it quite delightful to talk and communicate for hours on end. On his days off, Russell comes over to visit and makes jokes about our fake divorce, joking, "You two just went back to being lovers, didn't you?" However, the fact is that Dean and I never had a romantic relationship in the first place. Our marriage was planned. We seem to be developing a love relationship for the first time right now. We even have a cover agreement that says we will remarry if we are ever totally free from his mother, whether she dies, moves in with his sister, or enters a facility. Dean proposes that this would be the point at which his mother would no longer require welfare checks. Talks have already started on whether his sister and her husband would put her in a facility or begin living with her. Our get-together could not be too far off. It seems a little awkward to discuss, but after more than 30 years together, and as we approach our 50s, I'm excited about the possibility of falling in love with Dean, for whom I've always had a great deal of affection.